Hello, hello. Welcome, please come in. The fire's gone out, and it's time to talk about how that all went. Dark Souls 1 through 3 with only Pyromancies. Was it fun? Was it easy? Let's go through it. As I mentioned at the start of the Dark Souls 1 video, I've never actually used Pyromancy in any of the Dark Souls games. So I went into the series very curious how these runs would compare to the other spell-type runs I've done. And Pyromancy did not disappoint. Outside of a few specific bosses that I'm sure I'll talk about later, Pyromancy handled everything quite well. And despite the change in mechanics, not scaling off stats, then scaling off stats, Pyromancy was actually quite simple. If you can light it on fire, do so. If you can't, try poison. Or a rock, I guess. And I will say in full honesty that these games were, by a pretty decent margin, the fastest gameplay recordings I've had in any of these games. It is a bit of a shame that I couldn't include Demon Souls or Elden Ring in the series, since those games don't actually have Pyromancy, but that's okay. It was a nice palate cleanser. A nice easy series of videos to play and put together. But I think it's about time I got into the meat of the video. And we start with difficulty. Obviously a fun topic, because it is always a bit wild what game will or won't get ranked in the top spot. I have a pretty good idea of the relative difficulty of the Dark Souls games, but each game handles different challenge runs, well, differently. So it's always a bit of a ride making a decision within a specific challenge. And with only 3 games to choose from, this will be a bit shorter than prior videos. But that's okay, it's still an important avenue to compare the challenges before I get into the recommendation section later on. And I start with the first game, Dark Souls 1. And this game is going to get the middle slot. Dark Souls 1 Pyromancies only is really interesting, because it is obviously the first game in the series to have Pyromancies, but it also works very different on a mechanical level. Pyromancies don't scale off stats, instead scaling only off the level of your Pyromancy flame. I assume this was intended as a way to allow players of any build to pepper in a few Pyromancies, and it's not a panacea for all the game's ills, because there are a lot of fire-immune bosses in this game. Wait, is DS1 the only game with fire-immune bosses? Huh. A quick Google says Yorm is fire-immune in Dark Souls 3, and that is it. Interesting. Not really relevant to difficulty, except insofar as that you can't do a playthrough using only Pyromancies, because at least 2 of the bosses in the run are immune to fire and poison. I had to do some fun nonsense to get past those bosses, like summoning Mildred, or getting them to jump out of bounds. So I guess realistically I could put Dark Souls 1 at the top of the difficulty ladder, since it is actually impossible, but that feels disingenuous, because aside from the random impossible bosses, the other bosses weren't too bad. Pyromancy scaling meant as soon as I could actually upgrade the flame, my damage was good and stayed good. And despite being a spellcasting class, the actual speed of casting wasn't too bad. Pyromancies have decent range, good damage, and can handle most of the bosses this game throws at you. However, I don't think it belongs in the easiest slot. Despite Pyromancy's considerable power in this game, it is still limited against the big roadblock of many runs, Orny and Smoo. And, honestly, not much else. Don't get me wrong, Orny and Smoo are difficult and interesting, but I'm having trouble remembering any other boss being interesting. I guess Gwyn was challenging because of how aggressive he is and how little parrying practice I had. I'm watching back the video for DS1, and yeah, there really wasn't that much interesting about most of the bosses. Pyromancy just scales so well, it decimates the entire game. However, I don't want to place DS1 in last place because honestly, there is an easier game. Speaking of an easier game, and it's Dark Souls 2, slotting into last place. I really just think Pyromancies run rampant throughout this entire game. I'm trying to remember if any fight in this run was really difficult in any real way. I mean, there is the slight hang-up that you can't start with Pyromancy and have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get any offensive options, but I think it's pretty telling that the biggest cause of deaths in this run was dropping down the well right at the beginning, and not, actually fighting any of the game's key fights. Even the bosses that did kill me, it was mostly because I wasn't paying enough attention because of how strong Pyromancies are. While needing to buff up both faith and intelligence meant my durability suffered, that was actually equally true with DS1, where I had to spend a lot of souls upgrading my Pyromancy flame. which also meant I ended the game less durable than normal. All that, combined with the changes Dark Souls 2 made to poison, and how many bosses could be weirdly poisoned. And yeah, Pyromancy is usually an easy mode in Dark Souls games, but it's even easier in Dark Souls 2. Maybe that's why they locked Pyromancy behind several bosses. And we reach Dark Souls 3, which earns the top slot. Though earns is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. To say Dark Souls 3 is more difficult than the other games in the series using only Pyromancies is technically accurate, but the implication that it is at all difficult is not correct. Dark Souls 3 is really just a harder game, and Pyromancy is weirdly consistent across the series, which, come to think of it, is kind of the only spell school that I would describe as consistent. I mean, the feel of each type of spell hasn't changed drastically, but I think Pyromancy has done the best job of being the same feel of magic in every game. So Dark Souls 3 is harder than the other games, but it is still pretty easy. Pyromancy is just so good. Even bosses I thought would be difficult because of fire resistance just weren't, because Dark Souls 3 decided every spell school, except sorcery, should be able to deal a decent number of damage types. And Pyromancy got to add dark and physical to its repertoire. And considering the final boss is weak to dark, and basically nothing meaningfully resists physical damage, that's a good thing. Plus Boulder Heave knocking over enemies, traveling through enemies, and creating a little explosion at the end is so strong it's actually hilarious. I can only think of a few bosses that were not meaningfully countered by one of the spells or damage types I had access to. I'm thinking Dragon Slayer armor and probably the twins. And even those weren't really difficult thanks to the sheer damage I could output with Boulder Heave and Chaos Bed Vestiges, which, wow, really wish that name was shorter. So yes, Dark Souls 3 earns the highest rank in difficulty, but that isn't really the win Dark Souls 3 normally achieves in difficult. This is more success on a technicality, because to be frank, none of these games were difficult. And it's time for recommendations, aka the part where I make sweeping assumptions about which of these games would be best to do a Pyromancy only run based on my single playthroughs. Which is, of course, my favorite part, because I love to make sweeping generalizations and tell people how to live their lives. And how to sort through the Pyromancy only runs is a really interesting challenge, actually. Pyromancy is so consistent from game to game, there aren't really any huge outliers like previous video series have had. So you probably won't go wrong with doing any of the challenges in these games, but I will be going ahead and making my recommendations regardless, because that is the point of the video. And we start with Dark Souls 1, and this will earn second place, which is pretty comfortably mid for the first Dark Souls game. Not as good as first place, but definitely not the worst. And that absolutely fits with how I feel about Dark Souls 1. Pyromancies in Dark Souls 1 are a very weird niche. First, not leveling off stats means that, in theory, you could easily slap Pyromancy into any build at any time, assuming you haven't messed up the quests for the NPCs that can teach Pyromancies. All you need to do is level up that Pyromancy flame. However, that is a bit misleading, because you level, and upgrade the flame with, the same finite number of souls. I mean, they're not actually finite, but they are a very in-demand resource. So while you can level up as much as you want and not worry about stats, you will be very strapped for souls for leveling if you want to keep your Ascended Pyromancy Flame up to the level it needs to be. This is actually something I didn't realize until I was near the end of the game. I had expected to have tons of attunement, vigor, endurance, because I didn't need any other stat. What actually happened was I was just incredibly underleveled because I'd had to spend so many souls on the flame. Which isn't bad, it just means I ended the game no more durable than I was in sorceries or miracles only, despite not needing a specific stat to improve damage, because that flame is a soul hog. Beyond that, there is the issue that this is the only Dark Souls game that walls Pyromancy off completely. There are bosses in this game immune to both fire and poison, which eliminates the only ways Pyromancy deals damage. This wouldn't happen again until Yorm in DS3, but by then Pyromancy has dark and physical damage. To get through Pyromancy only in Dark Souls 1, you need to take some creative liberties with how you address certain bosses. Which isn't the biggest deal, but it does mean this boss cannot earn the top spot in the recommended list. But aside from those issues, the run is actually quite fun. Starts off with some early problem solving, then a rapid expansion of your toolkit to get through the game in relative safety. I think Orny and Smoo were the only really difficult fight, as they almost always are in a spell-only run. I mean, Gwyn took a bit, but that's because I haven't parried in several months. Ah, Dark Souls 2, my beloved. I really should look back through prior rankings, because despite really liking Dark Souls 2, I feel like I often rank this game lower than the others in actual comparison videos. And I will be doing that here as well. Dark Souls 2 gets to be dropped in last place. Don't mistake me, it's not that the Pyromancy only run was bad, it's just that the other two games were better. I actually had a good bit of fun with all the Pyromancy runs. It's just that Dark Souls 2 fails to meet the standard its predecessor set up in this run. And there are a few reasons for that. First is that you can't actually start as a Pyromancer, which means the first portion of the run is spent running around not being able to actually do any Pyromancies. Was a lot of this time spent dying in a well? Yes, but I think my point is valid. And after that, you get your first flame and some actual attack spells. The game then gets a little bit boring, actually. Despite now scaling off 2 different stats for damage, Pyromancy damage is very good throughout the entire game. And the sheer poison ability of almost every boss in this game is funny, but not necessarily fun. Pyromancy is probably stronger in DS2 than in any other game, relative to the difficulty, and combining that with DS2's in many cases kind of meh boss fights means the run is just sort of a gradual slide through okay territory. I'm thinking back through the boss fights and really trying to remember a single fight that was challenging. Even the fights that took more than one attempt were more because I was playing sloppy, unburdened by effort because of the strength of my spells, rather than actually difficult encounters. Pyromancy can just melt through every boss in the game, often with poison, sometimes with great combustion. And it actually hurts that upgrading the Pyromancy flame is done with specific fire seeds, rather than general upgrade items. It means another random item to hunt down all over the map. And the fact that fire seeds only matter if you're using Pyromancy means I did not have any good idea where most of them were. And while Pyromancy in DS2 is fun, I don't feel like it expands on Pyromancy in any interesting way compared to DS1, which is a bit odd. Most spell schools have a gradual progression of more and more spells changing the way you can play, leading into Elden Ring's actually unreasonable number of spells. So the Pyromancies are basically the same, the bosses are weak and very easy to kill, and so there isn't really anything that DS2 does better than DS1 or DS3, at least in the Pyromancy space. Which is a bit of a shame. But at least the run isn't actually just awful like some other last place contenders. And then there was one, and it goes in first, obviously. Dark Souls 3 is funny because it's always really swingy in a lot of ways. Is it a miserable experience because the tool you are using is bad or lacking in versatility? Or is it so easy it's just easier than any other way you could play the game? And Pyromancy falls firmly into the latter camp. Because while Dark Souls 3 earned the top spot in difficulty, that was mostly because the other games were even easier. And finally, Pyromancy adds some more options. I mean, you still get the old holdouts like Great Combustion and Fire Orb, but it also added Dark Element Pyromancies. And Boulder Heave. I do love Boulder Heave. It may be my new favorite spell because it is good, has too many different effects, and is also inherently a bit silly. I mean, come on, I'm spitting a boulder out and killing some deacons. This is hilarious. And the new versatility of Pyromancies means most bosses are what I want them to be. Puzzles to be solved. That is why I basically always use some variety of spells in any FromSoft game. I love the game of trying a boss, losing, and then looking over my options to see how I can address the boss differently. It is a bit of a departure from the get good attitude, which you do sometimes still need, but I do love to play around with a variety of options, and Dark Souls 3 always kills it with its expansion of what each spell type can do. And that is it! Pyromancy only runs are all completed, and the summary is done. I know this was a little bit of a shorter video than the summaries normally are, but there were only 3 games to go through, and, to be frank, there are only so many ways I can say Pyromancy good, Pyromancy strong, without it being a bit repetitive. For now, if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more of this, feel free to subscribe. Hey, maybe leave a comment if you have something you'd like to say. But whatever you decide to do, have a safe trip home.